What do you mean by judicial freeze? I'm the account holder, she's just the wife. She barely knows how to balance a checkbook. Grant screamed into his phone, his face turning the exact shade of red that cardiologists warn their patients about. The call was with his bank, and the words coming through the speaker were impossible, absolutely impossible. His platinum credit card had been declined at his country club in front of witnesses, and now this. The freeze was executed under Clause 14B of the prenuptial agreement that you signed, Mr. Reynolds. The one about shared risk management, the bank manager said in a professionally neutral tone that somehow made everything worse. I didn't read that. Vanessa said it was standard. Grant's voice cracked, desperation bleeding through the anger. I see. Well, it appears Mrs. Reynolds applied her expertise quite effectively. Were you aware, Mr. Reynolds, that your wife was a senior auditor for the IRS for 15 years before your marriage? The manager continued, almost sympathetically now. The phone slipped slightly in Grant's hand. The room seemed to tilt. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a memory tried to surface. A dinner conversation years ago, Vanessa trying to tell him about her work, and Grant cutting her off, telling her that business talk made women look unattractive. Grant had heard what he wanted to hear. When he'd met Vanessa, she'd said she worked in finance and he'd assumed secretary, maybe bookkeeper at best. He'd been too busy looking at her body to realize he was marrying the one woman capable of dismantling his entire financial empire. Grant Reynolds hadn't always been this stupid, but wealth has a way of calcifying arrogance into identity. He'd made his fortune in commercial real estate, the kind of deals that required aggressive accounting and creative interpretations of tax law. He was 52, divorced once already, when he met Vanessa Chen at a charity gala. She was 38, elegant in a way that made other women look like they were trying too hard, and when she laughed at his jokes, Grant felt like he'd won something. Their courtship was a whirlwind because Grant didn't believe in long engagements. Why would he? He knew what he wanted. Vanessa was beautiful, soft-spoken, and she'd mentioned she worked in finance before retiring early. Grant heard finance and pictured a secretary, maybe a bank teller at best. He was too busy imagining her on his arm at investor dinners to ask follow-up questions. When his friends asked what she did, Grant would wave his hand dismissively and say she'd worked for the government, some boring bureaucratic thing, nothing important. Vanessa never corrected him in public. She would just smile, that careful smile that didn't reach her eyes, and sip her wine while Grant dominated every conversation. The engagement dinner had been particularly revealing, though Grant had been too drunk on his own ego to notice. They were at Per Se, Grant's favorite power restaurant, surrounded by his wealthiest friends. Someone asked Vanessa about her early retirement, and she'd started to answer, saying she'd worked in government in a special division. So Vanessa, Grant said you retired early. What did you do? One of Grant's friends asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. I worked for the government in the division of. Oh, she was a bureaucrat, folks, stamped papers all day. Boring stuff, Grant interrupted with a loud laugh, his hand heavy on her shoulder. I saved her from that mediocre life, didn't I, honey? Now her only job is to spend my money and look beautiful. Vanessa smiled, gripping her wine glass a little tighter. Her eyes held something that should have warned him, a calculation, a careful notation of the offense to be collected on later. Actually, I investigated corporate fraud, Grant, she whispered. What's that, darling? Oh, forget it. Waiter, more champagne. Grant was already turned away, signaling across the room, completely missing the flash of steel in his wife's eyes. Grant didn't not know what Vanessa did. He chose to ignore it. For him, a beautiful woman couldn't possibly be intellectually dangerous. That would become his fatal error. If you're enjoying this story from Money Stories That Matter, hit that subscribe button right now because this tale is about to take a turn that'll make your jaw drop, and you won't want to miss what happens when arrogance meets expertise. The marriage was comfortable for Grant, which meant it was carefully orchestrated by Vanessa. She played the role he'd assigned her, the trophy wife who lunched with other trophy wives, who wore the right designers, who stayed quiet during business discussions. Grant's friends would joke about how lucky he was, how he'd finally found a woman who knew her place. And Grant would agree, feeling validated and superior. What he didn't notice was that Vanessa had started coming home with financial newspapers. He didn't notice that she'd set up a home office in the spare bedroom. He didn't notice that she was taking very specific phone calls and closing the door when he walked by. Because Grant didn't notice anything that didn't directly benefit Grant. The first crack in his carefully constructed ignorance came 18 months into their marriage. Grant's company was being investigated by the Securities and Exchange Commission over some creative accounting in a recent merger. Nothing serious, Grant told himself, just regulatory overreach. But his lawyers were nervous, and they'd suggested moving some assets around just as a precaution. Grant needed to hide about $15 million, money that existed in a gray area between legal and prosecutable. His attorney suggested putting it in Vanessa's name, creating a complex trust structure that would make it difficult to trace. Grant loved the idea. It was perfect. His airheaded wife wouldn't understand what she was signing, and even if the SEC came sniffing, they'd hit a wall of spousal privilege and corporate shell games. He'd waited until after dinner when Vanessa was in her bathrobe, her hair still damp from the shower. Grant had walked into the bedroom with a stack of documents, his expression casual like he was asking her to sign for a delivery. "Van, honey, sign this for me. My lawyer said we need to put the investment account in your name for tax purposes." "Estate planning stuff," Grant said, dropping the papers on the bed. Vanessa put on her reading glasses, those delicate frames that made her look like a librarian, and started actually reading the paperwork. "Estate planning, or because the SEC is investigating the Riverside merger?" she asked without looking up. Grant's blood ran cold for a second before he recovered with a nervous laugh. "Look at you reading the business section. Don't worry about big people business, sweetheart. Just sign. You trust me, don't you?" "I trust that you know what you're doing, Grant," Vanessa said, and then she signed every document. What Grant didn't understand, what his arrogance made impossible to understand, was that Vanessa hadn't signed because she was stupid. She'd signed because by putting $15 million of potentially fraudulent money in her name, Grant had just handed her complete control of his fate. She knew exactly what he was doing. She'd spent 15 years of her career tracking exactly these kinds of schemes. She knew that the moment his signature was on those documents, creating a trust in her name funded with money from questionable sources, he'd made her both the victim and the witness. And unlike Grant, Vanessa had actually read the prenuptial agreement, every single clause, including the one her own lawyer had inserted about shared risk management, which gave her unilateral control over any assets placed in her name if those assets were ever subject to legal investigation. The betrayal that finally triggered Vanessa's endgame wasn't financial. It was personal. Grant had been having an affair, not even a particularly discreet one, with a 26-year-old marketing executive from his company. Vanessa had known about it for months. She'd known because she'd hired a private investigator, not because she cared about Grant's fidelity, but because she needed documentation for the divorce. What pushed her to act was overhearing Grant on the phone with his mistress, laughing about how Vanessa was too dumb to notice anything, how she spent her days shopping and getting her nails done while he ran the real world. "She's my beautiful idiot," Grant had said into the phone, affection dripping from his voice like poison. "She has no idea." That night, Vanessa activated a plan she'd been preparing for 8 months. She contacted 3 different attorneys, all specialists in forensic accounting and asset recovery. She compiled every document Grant had ever asked her to sign, every bank statement, every corporate filing. She'd been building a case file that would make a federal prosecutor weep with joy. Then she'd called her former supervisor at the IRS, the one who'd tried to convince her not to retire early, and she'd asked a hypothetical question about how one might handle a situation involving spousal financial fraud. The answer had been thorough and devastating. The morning Grant discovered his accounts were frozen, Vanessa was having coffee in their living room, surrounded by neatly organized folders. Grant had come home from the country club humiliation in a rage, shouting about theft, about calling the police, about having her arrested. "You stole my money, I'm calling the police, I'll have you arrested." Grant's voice echoed through the house. Vanessa let him rant. She actually poured herself a second cup of coffee while he threatened her with lawyers and jail time. "Please do call them. I'd love to explain to the FBI how my husband used his dumb wife to launder $15 million, she said calmly when he finally ran out of breath. "You don't understand any of this. You're just a housewife playing detective." "Grant, remember our first date, when I told you I worked on Operation White Collar in New York?" Vanessa's voice was gentle, almost kind. "You said that women look ugly when they talk about work. You asked for the check." Grant's face went from red to white in seconds. The memory was flooding back now, sharp and humiliating. "I'm not an accountant, Grant. I'm a forensic auditor specialized in asset recovery." "And I just recovered my assets," Vanessa said, opening the first folder. Inside was a complete breakdown of every shell corporation Grant had created, every offshore account, every suspicious transaction. She walked him through it like she was teaching a freshman economics class, her voice never rising, her explanations crystal clear. She showed him how he'd committed securities fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. She showed him the emails he'd sent from his personal account, the ones his lawyers had told him to delete, but that she'd recovered from the cloud backup he didn't know she had access to. She'd laid out a case so airtight that Grant's own attorneys would advise him to plead guilty if she ever turned it over to authorities. Grant collapsed into a chair, his bluster evaporating. He tried a different tactic. You signed the documents too, you're complicit, he said, grasping at straws. Vanessa smiled then, genuinely smiled. Did I let me play you something? She pulled out her phone and pressed play. Grant's own voice filled the room. Don't worry about reading all that legal stuff, Van, just sign where I marked. You don't need to understand business, that's my job. There were hours of recordings. Every conversation where Grant had explicitly told her not to read what she was signing, where he'd dismissed her questions, where he'd called her too stupid to understand business. She documented every instance of his condescension, his mockery, his systematic exclusion of her from financial decisions. Any prosecutor would see her as a victim of spousal manipulation, possibly even financial abuse. Grant, on the other hand, would be seen as exactly what he was. What do you want? Grant finally managed to whisper. The money is in an irrevocable trust in my name, completely shielded from both government seizure and your access. I restructured it using entirely legal methods. If you try to contest it, I turn over every piece of evidence to the FBI and you spend the next decade in federal prison, Vanessa explained simply. If you cooperate, if you sign the divorce papers my attorney prepared, if you agree to a settlement that gives me the house and half of your remaining assets, I'll keep your secrets. I'll even give you an allowance. $5,000 a month. $5,000. I spend that on wine. Grant's voice cracked. Then I suggest you quit drinking. Better for your health anyway, Vanessa said, sliding the divorce papers across the table. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think Grant's biggest mistake was, because we love hearing your perspectives on these stories. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks later. Grant signed everything his attorneys put in front of him, their faces grave because they understood exactly how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. Vanessa had been methodical in her destruction. She hadn't just taken his money. She'd taken his reputation, his sense of superiority, his entire self-image. The prenuptial agreement he'd never bothered to read had contained clauses that Vanessa's attorney had carefully crafted, giving her rights to claim emotional damages, to seek compensation for career opportunities lost during the marriage, to retain all gifts and assets transferred to her name regardless of circumstance. Every signature Grant had scrawled without reading had been another nail in his own coffin. The house went to Vanessa, the 8-bedroom estate in Greenwich that Grant had bought to impress business partners. She kept the art collection too, pieces worth millions that Grant had purchased because a decorator told him they were good investments. The vacation home in Aspen, the membership to the yacht club, the vintage car collection, all of it was legally transferred to Vanessa through agreements Grant himself had signed while laughing about how wives didn't understand contracts. She'd even kept the dog, a purebred Russian terrier that Grant had never actually liked but had bought because it was expensive. Grant moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Stamford, the kind of place he used to drive past and feel grateful he'd never sunk so low. His friends stopped calling, partly because Vanessa had quietly let certain people know about his affair, but mostly because failure smells bad in wealthy circles and nobody wants to catch it. The $5,000 a month was enough to live on if Grant adjusted his expectations dramatically. No more $800 dinners, no more designer suits, no more private golf club where the initiation fee alone was 6 figures. Grant was learning to shop at normal grocery stores and discovering that most people didn't own multiple Rolex watches. The worst part, the thing that kept Grant up at night, wasn't the money. It was the knowledge that Vanessa had been planning this from the beginning, or at least from very early on. He'd replay their first conversations, looking for signs he'd missed. She'd told him on their second date that she'd worked in the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. He'd literally heard the words, and then changed the subject to talk about his real estate portfolio. She'd mentioned at their engagement party that she'd led the task force that took down a major accounting firm for fraud. Grant had joked that she was trying to impress him and told her she didn't need to try so hard. Every warning sign had been flashing neon bright, and Grant had been too blinded by his own reflection to notice. 6 months after the divorce, Grant ran into Vanessa at a restaurant in Manhattan. She was having dinner with a man in an expensive suit, laughing at something he'd said. She looked radiant, more vibrant than Grant had ever seen her during their marriage. When she noticed Grant watching from across the room, she'd raised her wine glass slightly in his direction, a small gesture that contained multitudes. Grant had left without ordering, unable to bear the weight of her smile. The man with Vanessa that night was a federal judge, someone she'd worked with years ago on a high-profile corruption case. They weren't dating, just old colleagues catching up, but Grant didn't know that. Grant didn't know a lot of things. He didn't know that Vanessa had been recruited back to the IRS as a consultant on complex fraud cases. He didn't know she was teaching seminars on asset recovery at Columbia Law School. He didn't know that she'd written an anonymous article for a legal journal about spousal financial manipulation that had become required reading in forensic accounting courses. He didn't know because he'd never asked, and now nobody was obligated to tell him anything. The $5,000 arrived in Grant's account every month like clockwork, an automated reminder of his own stupidity. He'd gotten a job eventually, a middle management position at a commercial real estate firm where nobody knew his history. His new boss was 15 years younger than him and made about a third of what Grant used to spend on watches. Grant kept his head down, did his work, and tried not to think about the fact that his ex-wife had essentially given him an allowance like he was a child. The story of Grant and Vanessa spread quietly through their former social circle, though the details got fuzzy in the retelling. Most people heard that Grant had made some bad investments and that Vanessa had gotten a good settlement. Only a few people knew the real story, the lawyers and accountants who'd witnessed the methodical destruction of a man by his own arrogance. They whispered about it at industry conferences, using it as a cautionary tale about prenuptial agreements and the importance of actually reading what you sign. Before we continue, if you haven't already subscribed to Money Stories That Matter, do it now because we bring you stories that reveal the truth about money, power, and the consequences of underestimating the people around you. Vanessa never spoke publicly about Grant. She didn't need to. Her reputation in financial circles had been rehabilitated and then elevated. The woman who'd retired early and disappeared into a wealthy marriage had returned as someone who'd played the longest con in white-collar history, using entirely legal means to extract herself from a toxic situation while securing her financial future. Young women in finance and law started reaching out to her, asking for mentorship, wanting to understand how she'd done it. Vanessa was always careful in her responses. She never encouraged anyone to marry for money or to manipulate partners. What she taught was simpler and more profound, that knowledge is power, that reading contracts is non-negotiable, that underestimation is a weapon if you know how to use it. Grant's second mistake after underestimating Vanessa's intelligence was assuming that silence meant consent. Vanessa had been silent during their marriage, but her silence was strategic. She'd been listening while Grant talked, learning while he showed off, documenting while he ignored her. Every dismissive comment he'd made, every time he'd talked over her or waved away her questions, she'd filed it away as evidence of a pattern. When the lawyers reviewed the recordings she'd made, they'd heard a masterclass in letting someone incriminate themselves. Grant had explicitly told her not to worry about business matters, not to read legal documents, not to ask questions about money. He'd created a perfect paper trail of financial manipulation without even realizing it. The $15 million that Grant had hidden in Vanessa's name had grown under her management. She'd invested it conservatively but intelligently, diversifying across legitimate holdings. By the time the divorce was final, it was worth closer to $18 million. Grant's share of their marital assets after legal fees and settlement costs came to about $4 million, most of it tied up in a retirement account he couldn't touch without penalties until he was 65. The math was devastating. Vanessa had started the marriage with essentially nothing and left with everything. Grant had entered the marriage as a multi-millionaire and exited as a cautionary tale. The IRS investigation that had prompted Grant to hide money in the first place had eventually concluded. The SEC had fined his company heavily, and several of his business partners had faced criminal charges. Grant had escaped prosecution, partly because Vanessa had restructured the $15 million in ways that removed it from the chain of evidence. She'd protected him, not out of loyalty, but because having him in prison would have complicated the divorce and potentially put her own settlement at risk. It was a purely strategic decision, the kind of calculated move that Grant had always prided himself on making in business, but had never seen coming in his personal life. Years later, Grant would tell people he'd learned his lesson about marriage, about women, about trust. But he hadn't really learned anything except to be more careful about who he underestimated. He dated occasionally women who found his story intriguing or who didn't know it at all. But he never remarried. The prenup Vanessa had gotten him to sign had contained a clause about future marriages too, something about her maintaining rights to certain assets if Grant attempted to hide money in subsequent relationships. His lawyers had explained that it was probably unenforceable, but Grant wasn't willing to risk it. Vanessa had beaten him so thoroughly that he was afraid to even try to play the game again. The real tragedy of Grant's story wasn't the money he lost. $15 million sounds like a lot, but Grant could have recovered financially if he'd wanted to rebuild. The real loss was his certainty, his unshakable belief in his own superiority. Vanessa had taken that from him, and unlike money, it couldn't be earned back. Every time Grant saw a beautiful woman in a professional setting now, he wondered what she really did, what she really knew, what she might be capable of. The arrogance that had once been his armor had become a cautionary tale he lived inside. Vanessa, for her part, had moved on completely. She'd bought a brownstone in Brooklyn, started a consulting firm that specialized in helping people untangle themselves from complicated financial situations. Her client list was confidential, but word got around that she was particularly effective at helping women discover assets their husbands claimed didn't exist. She never advertised. She didn't need to. Referrals came from divorce attorneys, from therapists, from women's support groups. Vanessa had found her calling, not in punishing men like Grant, but in empowering people who'd been systematically excluded from their own financial lives. The question people always asked when they heard the story was whether Vanessa had married Grant specifically to take him down. The answer was more complicated than that. She'd married him because he'd seemed charming at first, successful, confident. The red flags had emerged slowly: his dismissiveness, his need to dominate conversations, his assumption that her intelligence was decorative rather than functional. By the time Vanessa realized what kind of man she'd married, she was already in it. The decision to plan her exit so meticulously had come later, after Grant had made it clear that he saw her as an accessory rather than a partner. She hadn't set out to destroy him, she'd set out to protect herself. The destruction was just a side effect of his own actions. Grant's allowance continued to arrive monthly, $5,000 deposited with mechanical precision. It was enough to live on but not enough to thrive, which was exactly Vanessa's intention. She wanted him to be comfortable enough that he wouldn't try anything desperate, but uncomfortable enough that he'd remember every single day what his arrogance had cost him. It was a perfectly calibrated punishment, more effective than any court could have imposed. The final irony was that Grant had been right about one thing. Vanessa had worked in finance before their marriage, and she had been part of government bureaucracy. What he'd failed to understand was that the IRS Criminal Investigation Division wasn't where they sent people to stamp papers. It was where they sent their best hunters, the agents who could track money through shell corporations and offshore accounts, who could build cases that sent billionaires to prison. Vanessa had been one of their stars, someone with an intuitive understanding of how wealthy people hid assets and the patience to prove it in court. Grant had married exactly the wrong person to cross, and he'd been too arrogant to do even basic research on his own wife's background. So drop your thoughts in the comments, because we want to know what moment you think sealed Grant's fate. And don't forget that Money Stories That Matter is here every week with tales that prove the most expensive mistakes are the ones we make when we stop listening.